I'm Sandy Oliver, and this is going to be a lecture over Chapter 1 in the 7th edition of Power of Critical Thinking by Vaughn. This is for Humanities 115 at JCC, and off we go. I want to give you a little bit of an outline of what we're going to do and where we're going to go, and then I'm just going to have at it. I use the board a lot, so I will try really hard to leave it up long enough for you to actually use, but you can always pause, write things down, play, move on. Yeah, okay. So we're going to chapter 1. The title of the chapter is the same as the book, The Power of Critical Thinking. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call big words and go on from there. And then these are the sections of the chapter, okay, and what we're going to do underneath them. Why critical thinking matters, how it works, and then a little bit more in depth on reasons and argument and arguments in the rough. Basically, arguments you find in your daily life and reading and such. Your homework for this chapter is, like for all the chapters, a reading log of at least a page, and then the chapter 1 exercises that I've assigned. Okay. Chapter 1 tries to get us kind of grounded in our vocabulary, grounded in how we're going to talk about things, and gives us the first little bit of, okay, so why are we doing this? Why is this a book? Why is this a whole class? Okay. And I've had people ask me that. You teach what? That's a class? Critical thinking. Yes, believe me, it's a good class. A couple of things. As far as big words, at the end of each chapter, and I don't know if you've gone through and looked at the book and done this kind of stuff, but at the end of each chapter, there's a section by section summary, which can help you. My advice, honestly, is to go through and skim the summary and then read the chapter. Okay, this is not a murder mystery. It's not supposed to be figuring out who did what, right? You're building knowledge in your brain, and so you want to give it something to build on. Okay, so read the summary, and then go back and read the book, read the chapter. The beginning of the chapter has the outline of what they're going to do, and then they do it, and then there's the summary stuff. The keywords are right between the text of the chapter and the summaries. And they're just the keywords. They don't give you definitions. The good news is there's a glossary. If you go all the way to the back of the book, there's a glossary that defines things precisely. And it's the same definition that they give kind of laid out in the book. And that's the definition I want you to use for your big words, okay? Not Google, not Merriam-Webster. Use the book, okay? Partly because sometimes our definition in this class is more specific to logic and argument than the rest of the world uses, okay? And we'll get there when we get to the case in point is argument. What we think of when you say somebody had an argument, it's, they had a fight, they had a disagreement. An argument in our case is a claim, a conclusion backed up with reasons, premises, okay? So there's a bunch of sentences, and some of them are meant to support the other one, the conclusion, okay? That's an argument. And it can be a little frustrating at first because things will sound like something you know, but they have specific meanings. And this is true in any class you take, okay? Everything from, English 002 to, your, what is the one my husband teaches? Net 289, your capstone class. There are terminology and things that you have to learn in order to work well in that particular discipline. And that's true of logic and philosophy and all of that as well. So get used to it. It's not hard. It's just different. I know, which sometimes is the same thing. Okay, so the big words, these are the keywords at the end. 3 of them are what I've looked at as keywords, as big words: argument, critical thinking, CT, and statement, okay? They are also a little bit different from what we would normally like if we just had to give a definition off the top of our heads. But it's important. It's very important, okay, for our class. So a couple of things. The way the book is set up, you have your text, and then you have some boxes, and some of them are pale blue and some of them are just white like the rest of the page. But they are for further thought, and so it's a little encapsulation of information, sometimes just for fun, sometimes very important, and so I'll talk about those as well as we go through. And then off in the margins, there are often little cartoons, like political cartoon kind of things. Not all of them are political. And little quotes. And most of our discussion board quotes will come from there. Because we're in summer and I'm not making you do 2 discussion boards a week, that's just ridiculous. I'm leaving some of those out that I would normally put up for the weeklies, but that's okay. But they're interesting to think about. The first one that I think is really interesting, and I usually give it as a discussion board, is a quote by Socrates, who was Athenian orator and teacher, really, philosopher. He's one of the first philosophers to write things down. And to us, that seems very weird. But prior to the Greeks and all that, everything was oral. Okay, so if you wanted to remember something, you put it to a beat. Sounds familiar. Jingles. You put it to a beat, or you rhymed it up in poetry, and you remembered it that way. And some people spent their full lives learning particular stories or concepts or whatever, and being able to then teach others the same ideas. Thankfully, we get to write things down. I need to write things down. They're just not there. But Socrates said at the end of his life, the unexamined life is not worth living. And he doesn't mean that one life is less than another. For him, he was being sentenced to death because the authorities thought he was corrupting the youth of Athens. And he was doing that basically by telling them that, the gods aren't really gods. He kind of took it a step further than most of us would and said, basically, you are your own God. You control your own life. You control your own destiny. And he got put on trial, and they asked his students what he taught and what he did, and they told him he had to die. It was either exile to an island where he couldn't talk to anybody. Can you imagine an extrovert? There we go. Or he could stay, but he would have to live in jail. So life imprisonment, exile, or death. And he gives a big speech, the death of Socrates. And he had all kinds of fun. But he said that basically what you're asking me to do is not a choice. The unexamined life, if I can't share my life, be introspective about my life, look at my life, look at your life, it's not worth living. And so I wouldn't call it mythology, but the way the story goes, he drank hemlock, okay, and he died. And so Socrates is our first kind of, here's what you do with your life. Here's how you make sure that you're doing the right thing. Here's how you make sure that your thinking is right so that your actions and other things can be right. We all have a set of beliefs and assumptions that we use to make decisions, okay, whether we're totally conscious of that or not, okay. And we tend to ask, okay, what's true and what's not true. And there is a huge mess with this idea of my truth versus your truth. Those are opinions, okay? Truth is truth. Truth is a fact, okay? If it's not, then it's not truth. And we'll get more in that as we go along as well. Critical thinking is not about what you think, but how you think, okay? And it's not on what causes you to think a certain way, but whether that way is worth doing, whether that claim that you hold on to is worth believing. And Dr. Vaughn doesn't work a whole lot with faith and that kind of thing, so don't hear that, that's a separate deal. Critical thinking offers us a set of standards embodied in techniques and attitudes, principles that we can use to assess, okay, basically how good, how bad our beliefs are, and determine if they can be supported by good reasons. Okay. Now, our first thing, and this is our one of our big words, is critical thinking. If we're going to get anything done this semester, we have to know what this is, right? And so, make sure I'm giving you exact wording because I tend to slip. Okay? I always put quotation marks around anything that is exact. Okay? So, the systematic evaluation I wish my handwriting was better. And that you guys could read cursive. The systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. And this is on page 4, I believe. Let me make sure. For some reason, I didn't put that in my notes. How bad of me. Yes. Bolded and in red on page 4, critical thinking. Okay? So this is the definition you should write on your test. This is the definition you should, basically print on your heart. Here we go. So the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. Okay? It is systematic because we use distinct procedures and methods. This is not all touchy-feely, fuzzy stuff, okay? This is, we do this way all the time, okay? And so it's a distinct procedures and methods. Sorry, it's been a little while since I've written the board. And we're talking about evaluation and formulation because it belongs in the area of assessing existing beliefs and formulating new ones. It's rational standards because we're judging by how well they're supported. Now, all this comes down to a little bit of logic. I'm always tempted to put this on the big words, but anyway. Logic is the study of good reasoning. The study of good reasoning or inference. Okay, sorry. Good reasoning, or what's also called inference, and the rules that govern it. Now, that last part is going to be hard for some of you. This is also page 4. And what I mean by that is there are particular rules of logic that are not suggestions. This is how we do it, this is why it works. And sometimes it makes total sense. You're like, oh yeah, that's true. And sometimes you just have to basically do the cursor and say, yeah, okay, that's how it works. But it does. It just doesn't always make sense on every day. Ultimately, why it matters, okay? Ultimately, what critical thinking leads you to is knowledge, understanding, and, if you put these to work, empowerment, okay? So Professor Vaughn says we go from, I can't talk and write evidently today, knowledge, okay, to understanding, usually what we believe, to empowerment. Now, I know probably the last place you thought you would hear about empowerment is in a critical thinking class. Okay, isn't that full of rules and weirdness? Well, yes and no. Okay. It matters. Okay. It matters because how we think determines how we act and what choices we make. So our thinking needs to be correct, right? We don't need to be delusional. We don't need to be what my dad would say is pie in the sky. It doesn't exist for us. It's there, but it's not useful. And remember that your beliefs are yours only if you critically examine them. Otherwise, you don't know if they have good reasons behind them or not. Now, a lot of folks will use that particular notion to totally throw their hands up in the face of faith or religion or anything like that. And I think it's normal and natural and fine to question and do, your own search for truth that way. But give it a chance. And remember, too, on that same line, that most people that practice a particular religion do it imprecisely and imperfectly because that's who we are as humans. Don't let somebody else's practice become your reason for, I don't do religion. I don't do it. Okay, you worship something. You think something's important. Why do you think that's important? Okay, so your beliefs are yours only if you critically examine them for yourself. Okay, so empowerment. We have a few things here. Empowerment is a big buzzword these days and has been for quite a while. What critical thinking does to empower you is to give you skills for learning and exploring, defense against error I don't know about you, but I hate to be wrong. I hate to have to apologize and show and be weird that way. Um, so I'm happy for that. And sorry. Tools for self-discovery. Once we begin looking at our beliefs critically, not in that nitpicky critical way, but critically, and we find out which ones of our beliefs are actually worth believing. Okay, there are things we believe when we're children that we grow out of. Okay, there are things that we believe when we're in high school that we grew out of. There are things that we believe in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that we grow out of. We're constantly learning more about ourselves, learning more about our world, and figuring out what's worth carrying with us. And if we never do that, imagine the clutter in your head, one, but also how willy-nilly strange your life would be if you didn't have kind of a compass in there somewhere. Okay. So one of the things that critical thinking empowers you to have these skills for learning and exploring. Every discipline, every line of work, every activity has its own set of rules and jargon and ways of doing things that the people who are already in those just know because they've internalized it. When you're new to something, you have to learn the ropes, right? You have to learn how things work here. Even if, say, you're changing jobs, you're going from one company to another, but you're doing the same thing. It's going to be different at the other company. It's just going to, because there's a different set of people there. There's a different set of rules there. There's a different set of how things work. And so we have to be careful. But critical thinking allows us to move through that initial phase fairly confidently because we can look at things and find out if they have good reasons or not. Sometimes we get the glory for helping a system get refined, revived, because we're new and we know how things are supposed to run. And this is not going that way, so let's do this. Yeah, it's fun. The other pieces here, defense against error, manipulation, and prejudice, okay? And part of that with critical thinking is because you're looking at these ideas and thinking about why do we do this? Why do we do it this way? Okay, here is where a lot of our current troubles as a nation are coming in. Okay, so why is it true that minorities, people of color, are incarcerated at a rate sometimes triple or quadruple that of majority white folks? Same crimes, get different punishments. Because we've always done it that way. That's a horrible reason. It's a fallacy. We need to know what is right and what is wrong, and to keep it the same for everybody. And we don't. And if you think we do, you haven't thought critically about it. You haven't looked at the evidence. And we're going to talk more about experts and evidence in another chapter. But defense against error, defense against manipulation, because again, you can look at the way somebody is treating you, or you can look at the way you're being asked to work and go, that's not right. Okay, it's illegal for your boss to ask you to work before you clock in. or after you clock out. It's illegal. You're not allowed to do it. But I have worked many jobs where that was the case. It's illegal. They're not supposed to do it. But unless you know that, or unless you think, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm working for a wage. I have to clock in to get that wage. But you want me to do these 3 things before I clock in? That's not good. And against prejudice. Okay. And we're going to look at some other things more carefully a little bit later. But part of this is, how can you prejudge a situation or a person? You can't. If you don't know anything about them other than what they look like, how do you know? How do you know whether this is a good person or a bad person? How do you know what they're going to do or what they're going to say or how they're going to work? It's a terrible system, but we do it all the time. And prejudice and stereotyping are basically taking a huge leap from some folks do this to this person who I don't know does this. It's hard. We would never want somebody to prejudge us. And again, it's do unto others kind of thing. The other part of this is self-discovery. Okay. When we discover what we believe and we're appalled or we're excited, we've learned something about ourselves we didn't know before. And it sounds really silly on the surface to say, you're going to learn more about yourself. Well, you live in the self all the time, so what's the deal? The deal is we don't think about who we are and why we're doing things most of the time. And we should more often than we do. Now, I'm not saying you have to micromanage, that's not the word I want, overthink everything every day, all the time. We have enough trouble with anxiety and stuff in our lives these days. But it's a good idea to think about, okay, what did I do today? Ooh, I did that. Ooh, I wish I had done that. Okay, how can I fix it? How can I make amends? How can I learn and grow from that? Those are the critical thinking pieces, okay? Knowing yourself better. Now, when we're knowing ourselves better, we end up with this lovely thing called a worldview. And we're actually going to talk about this in another chapter, so it's not up there for this time. But this is your philosophy of life. It's not how you look at the world, at least not directly. This is your philosophy of life. Now, you have one, whether you are conscious of it or not. Okay? So, everybody has a worldview. Everybody acts on that worldview all the time. Most of us are pretty aware of certain aspects. Okay? The definite, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of our life is lived there in that gray area. And so we have to make decisions, and sometimes we make the wrong decision, and then we have to do something about it. On the bottom of page 6 in the book, Dr. Vaughn starts with the counter-argument. Not his counter-argument, but folks who would say that critical thinking really isn't that good. You really shouldn't spend so much time on it. And so he goes through the counter-arguments. There's some, many people, sorry, I'm going to look at my notes because I can't read that far away. Eyeballs, oldness. Critical thinking applies not just to some of your individual beliefs, but to all of them together, your worldview, your philosophy of life, okay? Some folks believe that critical thinking, or what they take to be critical thinking, makes one excessively critical or cynical, emotionally cold, and creatively constrained. It's on page 6. Dr. Vaughn then goes at great ends to refute these. Okay, the critical in critical thinking is used in the sense of exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation. Okay, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Critical thinking and feelings actually complement one another. Our emotions are in need of the guidance of reason. Okay, and I'm a very analytical person. I am OCD, so I have those. You have to do things the same way all the time. But I'm also a very emotional person. I don't know if you guys know Myers-Briggs. I'm an INFJ. I run everything through my emotions. I have to be careful with that, though, because sometimes my emotions go, wah, and it doesn't deserve that. Usually my husband is the brunt of that. Unfortunate for him. Critical thinking can complement creative thinking because it's needed to enhance and assess the creation. So most artists, and I live with a house full of them right now, most artists, we tend to do our art and then pick it apart because that's how we are. Using critical thinking is not picking it apart. It's looking at the parts of whatever your creation is that work well and enhancing those, looking at the things that didn't work so well and downplaying or getting rid of those. It's a second draft, okay? We know life is a series of edits, right? If we were the same person now that we were 5 years ago, that would be kind of weird. We need to grow and emerge, and this is a big deal, okay? On page 8, the top of page 8 is one of these nice little boxes, that Dr. Vaughn does throughout the chapters that gives you kind of a review, okay? Here's why critical thinking matters. There's the done. Critical thinking is something we could all do more of and do better at. And this is especially true of the United States, of our political machine. Lots more critical thinking needs to be going on there across the board. So it's important, critical thinking, for empowerment, for defense against error, for all of this stuff. It's also a way of doing things, okay? And I'm going to erase a bunch of stuff, so pause now if you need to write it down, or go back, okay? I'm going to get rid of this. Okay. In this next little section here, we're going to look at how it works. Now, good critical thinking is the same everywhere, okay? We take things apart, we look at things in sections, we see how they fit together, and then we see how well they fit together, okay? One is nuts and bolts, and the other is an assessment, an evaluation, and so that's kind of how that goes. A statement, just one of our other guys. It's also a claim. It can be a premise or a conclusion. It can be a belief. A statement is an assertion that something is or is not the case. And let's see. page 8. Okay. Statements are sentences that are either true or false. Okay. Statements are not questions. Statements are not commands. And go back to your probably 8th grade English, somewhere around in there. Think about the declarative sentence. Okay. It's cold in this room. I can tell my hands are turning purple. My tea is almost gone. Those are statements. Okay. Why are the drapes pulled? That's a question, not a statement. When we're looking at an argument, we're going to get to that in just a second. When we're looking at an argument, we have to think about what are we actually making a claim about and how are we supporting that. Okay? Or what are we reading? Same kind of deal. There are some statements, bottom of page 8, top of page 9. Some sentences do not express statements. Clean your room. Okay, that's in various ways of yelling or speaking. That's a command, right? Go do that. Turn the music off. Stop telling lies. Hey, dude. I don't know if people still say dude. But anyway, all kinds of exclamations, greetings. They're not statements, and you're going to get some practice looking and identifying. Okay. When you look at critical thinking, you're looking at statements, okay, a systematic evaluation or a formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. So you're looking at statements, and you want to know how much you should believe them. That's our big deal, okay? The strength of your belief, though, should not depend upon how you feel about it. That's hard. And that's part of the reason for the first paper. It's hard to look at something, look at a statement, and evaluate it on its own merits. What kind of support does it have? Are those reasons good and true? How can we find that out? What kind of things count as evidence? Depends upon the discipline, the type of stuff you're doing, all of that. Sometimes you might not be able to find substantial reasons, but maybe you've got one. Okay, I like things in threes. Most folks resonate with that, but if your support is dubious or lacking, then you need to proportion your belief to the evidence, not to your heart. Not all the time, anyway. So, reasons provide support for a statement. Okay. Now, a reason. Sorry, I'm looking for a pen. A reason is the same thing as a claim or a statement. Okay. Your reason is your support. Okay, and we're trying to support our idea here. So if I have a claim or a statement, a claim without reasons is an opinion. Now, that opinion may be right, may be wrong. At this point, we don't know because we don't have any support for it. We don't have any reason to believe it. And that is one of the things when we're looking at another chapter. If there's no good reason for believing something, then don't. Okay? Okay. Argument is our other big word. Put it red just because it's kind of fun. Argument. Oh, and when one of these things has exact words like that, and it has stuff in parentheses, that doesn't mean you get to leave it out. Okay, exact wording. Some of these are very important. Okay, so this is on page 10. A group of statements in which some of them in parentheses, the premises, are intended to support, intended is important here, another of them. The conclusion. Okay? Reasons are the logical links. This is something you'll hear me ask about. As we go along. The logical links from one piece of support to another, eventually to the conclusion, are the reasons for us to believe this. Okay? Now, we've talked about inference already, being able to reason from a premise or a bunch of premises to a conclusion based on those premises is inference. Okay, and we talked about logic is inference and the rules that govern it. Okay, there are lots of things that look like, might even sound like an argument, but there's no main idea to be supported. Okay, it's just a bunch of random facts, or it's unsupported opinion, which is more likely than that. On page 11, he starts giving you some examples of things, and that'll be helpful for you. Sometimes people confuse explanations with arguments, but an explanation tells us why or how something is the case. It doesn't give us reasons for believing that something is the case. Okay, explanation. Now, lots of arguments need explanation in order for us to understand them. Okay, but that explanation is not technically part of the structure of the argument. Okay, let that run around your head a little bit. Now, on page 13, there is quite a bit of fun stuff, these indicator words. Okay, now, personally, I don't take a whole lot of stock in these. They are helpful when they show up, absolutely, but they don't always show up. So if you rely on them too much to explain or whatever how things are going, you're going to run into problems. Premise indicator words, things like because, given that, since, for. Okay. Conclusion words can be very helpful, especially when we get into the deductive stuff. Excuse me. Therefore, thus, consequently, so. Hence, ergo, which is Latin for therefore. Some people use it to sound pretentious, I think. Anyway, there are some things here to kind of help you play with those as well. And then the biggest advice for anybody trying to figure out if a paragraph or a paper or whatever has an argument is to find the conclusion. And it sounds really weird. Conclusions are not always at the end, which I know is kind of weird, but there it is. The conclusion in this case is the statement that we're trying to defend or that we're trying to give reasons for. It's the one that the rest of the statements are trying to support. Okay, so most of the time, our claim is that we should do something about X. Okay, we should do something about the high price of gas. Okay, or we should do something about the hole in the parking lot, or we should do something about something personal. Okay, should do something about that friend that really torqued you off the other day. Anyway, what's the main idea? What's the conclusion? Everything else should be supportive of that conclusion. Now, a lot of longer papers and such, and we're going to get to that in chapter 3, have problems with putting in too much information that we don't need. And this is why we focus a lot on the structure of the argument to determine what kind of argument it is and what it's trying to do. Okay. Arguments in the rough. We're looking at claims, reasons, and arguments. This is the review notes at the top of page 15. Most arguments also contain a whole lot of background information, repetition, extraneous details, explanations, and you've got to strip them down to their essence in order to figure out, do I really have an argument here? Find the conclusion first, then identify what premises support it. The rest is just noise, okay? When we get to chapter 3 and we're looking at arguments specifically, we'll work with that. And then I love this ending piece Dr. Vaughn has. Since you are, as Aristotle says, a rational animal, you already have the necessary equipment, namely a logical sense that helps you reason in everyday life and enables you to begin honing your critical reasoning. Okay? It's page 16. Now, I know this is long. I probably should have broken it up into 2, but I like to do a chapter at a time when I can, like this. So you can pause and move on and all that. You know that stuff already. Your homework, of course, is a reading log for chapter 1. That is at least a page of notes and notes, summary, outline, whatever. And then the chapter 1 exercises. Those will be posted up on Blackboard. And remember, in order to get full credit, you need to answer all the questions that are assigned. If you want extra practice or extra credit, do more than that, and you'll get extra credit that way. Extra credit tops out at 10%. So you can get homework assignments and rough drafts are 20 points. And so they can be 22 points if you do a super good job for the reading log, at more than a page, whatever. And then the exercises for chapter 1 or whatever, more than I assign, get you extra credit. If you have questions, make sure you give me an email. I'm happy to help. Read the book, do the work. It's all good. Bye. Have a great day.